as President of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the organisation responsible for the creation and upkeep of the magnificent and deeply moving Menin Gate.
He was the oldest man in the room. 90 years old. Newly widowed. His body visibly failing, one arm held steady by Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, who kept her grip gentle and constant because she understood that letting go was not an option. The November air at the cenotaph was cold and thin, and the ceremony was moving around him in the way it always moves, measured, solemn, the kind of silence that a nation has agreed to observe because some losses are too large for noise. He had attended this ceremony more times than most people could count. He had stood in this place through the deaths of kings and the crowning of queens. He had outlasted scandals that nearly tore the monarchy apart. And through all of it, across 9 decades of watching and serving and saying absolutely nothing that was not required of him, he had kept his own counsel with a discipline that most human beings are simply not capable of sustaining. But on this morning, something was different. He saw Camilla. And he turned his back on her, not with confusion, not with the uncertainty of a man whose body was failing him. He saw her and he turned away completely, the way you turn from something you have made a final decision about. And then he moved toward Catherine. He took her hand. He held it longer than the moment required. And he leaned close and said something that only she could hear. The people standing nearby could not look away. And those who later described what they witnessed said the atmosphere in that space changed immediately, as though something that had been held in place by silence for a very long time had finally, quietly, been released. What he said was pieced together afterward by people close to his household. It was not long. It was not theatrical. It was the kind of thing a man says when he has been thinking about it for 30 years and has simply run out of reasons to wait any longer. He told her the jewels were going where they belonged. And if you want to understand what those words actually mean, what they carry, what they cost, and why this particular man saying them to this particular woman in this particular place is one of the most quietly extraordinary things to happen inside the British monarchy in decades, then you need to understand who Edward, Duke of Kent, actually is. Because without that, the moment at the cenotaph is just an old man's gesture. With it, it is the closing sentence of a story that began more than 200 years ago. He became the Duke of Kent when he was 6 years old. His father, Prince George, was killed in an RAF flying accident in August 1942, a wartime crash in Scotland that left his mother a widow and left a small boy with a title he had no idea how to carry. He grew into it the only way available to him, by watching the institution that surrounded him and learning, with absolute thoroughness, what it required. Duty. Discretion. Presence. Service. And above everything else, silence about the things that cost you most. He held that dukedom for over 82 years, which makes him the longest-serving duke in British history. He and King Charles are the only 2 members of the royal family who hold the rank of Field Marshal in the British Army. For more than 50 years, he sat in the royal box at Wimbledon and presented the trophy as patron of the All England Club, a fixed, reliable, utterly unshowy presence in a world that increasingly rewarded spectacle over substance. But none of that is what the Duke of Kent will be remembered for. What he will be remembered for is his mother. Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark arrived in Britain in 1934 to marry Prince George, and the country was not quite prepared for her. She was dark-haired and precise and possessed of a kind of European elegance that made the people around her sit up slightly straighter. She had grown up in exile, the Greek royal family had been expelled from Athens when she was a child, and she had spent her formative years moving between Paris and the courts of Europe, carrying her bloodlines and her composure with equal care. Those bloodlines ran deep. Through her maternal line, Marina was directly connected to the Romanov dynasty, the Russian imperial family that had been marched into a basement in Ekaterinburg in July 1918 and shot. The cousins she never met. The history that existed in her blood and nowhere else. And in her jewelry, that history had a physical form. The Cambridge sapphires, a set that had begun their journey with Princess Augusta, Duchess of Cambridge, in the 19th century, passed to Queen Mary after Augusta's death in 1916, and been given by Queen Mary to Marina as a wedding gift in 1934. The Kent Pearl Festoon Tiara. The Diamond Girandole Earrings. The Pearl Fringe Tiara. The remodeled diamond bandeau that had once belonged to Queen Mary herself. each piece carrying inside it not just beauty and craft but the specific weight of the women who had worn it before. Marina wore them through grief that most people will never be asked to survive. She wore them as a widow raising 3 children alone after the crash that took her husband. She wore them as a woman who had watched the world she came from, the old European royal order, the Russian imperial line, collapse entirely within her own lifetime. She understood, in a way that perhaps only exiles truly can, that objects outlast empires. That the thing you pass forward to the next set of hands may be all that remains. The Duke of Kent was the last person still living who remembered the hands that first wore them. Financial pressure in the 1990s forced painful decisions. The sapphire tiara was sold. The necklace. The stomacher. The buyers were never fully confirmed publicly, and some of those pieces may have left Britain entirely. What remained was smaller, but it was still extraordinary, and it still carried everything Marina had placed inside it. By November 2025, the Duke was the sole guardian of that remnant. Newly widowed. Frail. Fully conscious, those close to him insisted, of exactly what he was holding and exactly what it would mean to place it correctly. What the Duke carried to the cenotaph that morning was not only his mother's history. It was 30 years of something that had no clean name, a sustained, private accumulation of grief and observation and moral reckoning that had never once found its way into public speech. His wife, Catherine, had not been an easy royal. Not in the sense the institution preferred. She had suffered in ways that could not be managed or contained, a serious mental breakdown in the 1970s that required hospitalization, years of severe depression that pulled her in and out of public life without explanation, a conversion to Catholicism that placed her quietly outside the Church of England and made her a subject of whispered commentary in certain palace circles. She had eventually withdrawn from royal duties almost entirely. She had spent the last years of her life largely out of the public eye. To the people who genuinely loved her, she was one of the most sincere and most damaged human beings ever to carry a royal title. She had given everything the institution asked of her, and the institution had given her nothing adequate in return. Inside Camilla's circle, she was something else entirely. Former staff described gatherings where the Duchess of Kent's struggles became entertainment. Where her breakdowns were recounted with mimicry and laughter. Where the word that kept surfacing was unstable, delivered not with concern but with the particular contempt of people who have never genuinely suffered and cannot imagine why others cannot simply stop. Camilla, by multiple accounts, did not discourage this. She was present. She participated. She threw her head back and laughed at a woman who was not in the room to defend herself. Catherine never knew the specifics of what was said. But the Duke knew. Every word of it reached him. There is a specific kind of damage that occurs when someone you love is made into a joke by people who hold power over your life. It does not announce itself. It does not explode. It simply closes something permanently, like a door with no handle on the inside. After the Duke learned what was being said about his wife in those rooms, the cold between him and Camilla became absolute. Not performative. Not political. Absolute. And then, layered beneath even that, there was Diana. The Duke of Kent was a first cousin to Queen Elizabeth. He was a senior working royal throughout the 1980s and 1990s. He sat in rooms where things were said that the public was never permitted to hear. He knew what was happening to Diana, not from newspapers, not from biographies, but from the proximity that comes with being inside the institution during the years when it was grinding her apart. He knew that Diana was hurting herself. That she was chaining herself in when the pain became unbearable. That she stood in front of a mirror at her lowest point and cut her own hair and asked, to no one in particular, whether this was what Charles had wanted, whether making herself unrecognizable would finish what he had already started on her from the inside. He knew that Camilla was at the center of Diana's suffering. And in the way of men from his generation, men who had been trained since childhood to place the institution above every personal feeling, he said nothing and kept serving. But he did not forget. And he did not forgive. The decision he announced at the cenotaph had not been made at the cenotaph. It had been building in total silence across decades, and what the cenotaph provided was simply the moment, the right woman, the right ceremony, the right weight of occasion for what he had already, irrevocably, concluded. In the aftermath of Queen Elizabeth's death in September 2022, the inventory and allocation of the Queen's personal jewelry had moved through the institution with a thoroughness that left very little to interpretation. Catherine had quietly expressed interest in a specific diamond brooch, a piece Diana had worn, a piece Catherine had been photographed studying in archival footage. The brooch carried a meaning for her that had nothing to do with its diamonds. When the allocation was finalized, the brooch had gone to Camilla. Catherine absorbed this the way she absorbs everything that costs her deeply, in complete silence, carrying it alone. Staff who saw her in the days following described someone moving through her public engagements hollowed out, her eyes swollen, quieter than her quietest. She made no statement. She never would. Then a tiara request. Then a state banquet. Then Camilla, at a semi-private dinner, describing Catherine's practice of wearing Diana's jewelry as performance as exploitation of grief. She is using a dead woman as a costume. Said openly, with contempt sitting plainly on her face, to a room full of people. The Duke watched it all. He watched a pattern he had seen once before 30 years earlier, in a different woman's life, repeat itself with only the names changed. And in early 2024, the final piece arrived. Catherine's cancer diagnosis. The surgery. The months of carefully maintained silence while the world speculated and worried and the palace offered almost nothing. And then her return, not as a performance, not as a managed reappearance, but as someone who had genuinely passed through something and come out the other side changed in ways that were visible and real. She stood at Windsor. She appeared at Trooping the Color. She returned to public life on her own terms and no one else's. The Duke of Kent had spent 9 decades watching people break under the weight of this institution. He had watched Diana break. He had watched Catherine break. He had watched the machinery of the palace treat human suffering as an inconvenience to be managed. And he had watched Catherine absorb blow after blow, the jewelry, the mockery, the diagnosis, the silence and refuse, with a consistency that was neither performance nor policy, to break. He made his decision. The Cambridge sapphires did not begin with Marina. They did not begin with Queen Mary. They began with Princess Augusta, Duchess of Cambridge, in the 19th century, a woman placing something precious into the hands of the woman who would come after her, trusting that the chain would hold. Augusta to Queen Mary. Queen Mary to Marina, on her wedding day in 1934, with a directness and an intention that was not accidental. More than 200 years of women carrying something forward. The Duke of Kent, standing at the cenotaph with Sophie's hand steadying him and the cold November air around him, and perhaps the last appearance at this ceremony he would ever make, this man understood the weight of that chain with a completeness that no one else alive could match. He was the last living memory of Marina wearing those pieces. He was the final keeper. And the woman he was choosing to place them with next had married into the Cambridge title in 2011. Had spent 14 years treating every jewel she wore as a living thing with a story that demanded continuation. Had worn Diana's earrings and Queen Elizabeth's brooches not as accessories but as arguments, as quiet, insistent proof that the people who came before were not gone, that their presence could be carried forward by someone who understood what it cost them to get here. When Catherine wore a tiara at the state banquet for the US president in September 2025, every person in that room knew she was wearing more than diamonds. When she chose Queen Elizabeth's pearl earrings at Commonwealth Day in 2026, she was making sure Elizabeth remained present in a room that had moved on. She had never once worn these pieces carelessly. She understood that jewelry at this level is not decoration. It is memory made physical. It is the proof that something survived. The Duke understood this about her. He had watched her long enough to know it was not cultivated. It was not strategy. It was something she genuinely felt, and genuine feeling at that level is something you cannot produce through training or intention. You either have it or you don't. Camilla, for all her titles and her decades and her secured position, had never once produced it. Camilla went to Charles after the cenotaph. She made her case precisely that a senior royal had publicly endorsed Catherine's claim over the sitting queen consort, that it was an institutional problem, that it undermined the hierarchy of the crown. Charles listened. Charles always listens to Camilla. She has shaped more decisions inside this monarchy than the public has ever been permitted to know. This time, Charles did not move. Because the Duke's private collection is not crown jewels. It is not the royal collection. It belongs to him personally, legally, completely. He can gift it. He can will it. He can place it wherever he chooses, to whoever he decides, for whatever reason he holds privately, and has no obligation to explain to anyone. Camilla had no claim. She never did. Charles looked at her and told her the Duke was entitled to his own private decisions. She left without a word. And the people who know her understand that silence after a lost argument is not acceptance. But there was nothing left to argue. The decision had already been made. The words had already been spoken. And the woman they had been spoken to had already understood what they meant. The last time anyone saw Princess Marina wearing the Cambridge sapphires, it was decades ago. The tiara that survived her exile and her widowhood and the financial pressures that stripped so much away, it has not appeared at a major royal occasion in years. The Kent pearl festoon tiara, the diamond girandole earrings, the pearl fringe tiara, sitting somewhere quiet, largely invisible, waiting.